Today, on part 12 of our ZJ Project series, things get shaky and wobbly, and it is bad. That's right, we have full-on death wobble, and on this episode, we'll be diagnosing and making some upgrades to hopefully rid our Jeep once and for all of this absolutely horrible thing.
Back in 2014, I purchased my first Jeep ever, which is this, a 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee Laredo. With the big 5.2 liter V8 engine and low miles, this completely stock ZJ was full of potential. Since then, well, we've done a few upgrades and modifications. Past projects include a 3.5-inch lift, transfer case swap, custom roof rack, lights, skid plates, and so much more. We've transformed this stock ZJ into a capable off-road rig and reliable daily driver that's taken us all across Arizona. Today, we continue the project.
Now, this video is going to be broken up into two different segments. I want to start off by talking about the history of death wobble that I've had with my Jeep. That way you can get a full understanding of how it has slowly developed over the last 3 years. Most of the video will be spent on the actual death wobble diagnosis and solution, so if you would like to skip all the backstory, you can jump to the timestamp that you are seeing on screen right now. Otherwise, I just want to spend a couple of minutes explaining how the warning signs for death wobble have actually been showing themselves over the last several years, and how our fixes in the past weren't actual fixes. So I'm going to begin this story all the way back in July of 2014. That is when I first got this Jeep. At the time, it was completely stock and had around 133,000 miles on it. Within a month or so, I had installed the 3.5-inch lift and put on my new wheels and bigger tires. Now, these big changes obviously affected how the Jeep drove. The suspension components had been changed, the tires were bigger and heavier than before, so it took some adjustment for sure. But the Jeep drove pretty great. It was relatively smooth, sort of quiet, and I was enjoying the new ride height and look. Now, over the next year and a half, I added some new components, did some other modifications, both on the mechanical side and cosmetic side of the Jeep. But steering and suspension were solid and the Jeep was still driving great. In February of 2016, about a year and a half after I bought the Jeep, is when I got the very first hint of death wobble. I was out on a trip and I was on the road north of Quartzsite. I was cruising on the highway around 55 or 60 miles per hour and I hit a bump. After the bump, I felt a slight wobble or shake in the steering wheel. It went away fairly quickly and it seemed kind of minor, and at the time, I really had no idea what it was. I thought it may have been related to the roof rack, since I did have my tire and high lift jack up there. At the time, my roof rack was less than a year old, and I thought maybe the rack was bouncing from the bump. I wrote it off as normal and let the issue go. A couple of weeks later, I was on another trip down in Tucson. I was on some surface streets in downtown, and I hit another bump, going a little bit slower than last time. This time, the Jeep violently shook, the steering wheel vibrated back and forth, and I thought for sure that something underneath came loose or had broken off. I quickly stopped, pulled off the road, and spent the next hour looking at the Jeep. I jacked it up, checked all the tires, tried to wiggle the suspension components, but everything looked fine. I couldn't believe that nothing was broken as the Jeep had just been shaking so violently. Through some online research, I quickly came to the realization that what I had just experienced was in fact the dreaded death wobble that everyone talks about. After getting back home from that trip, my dad and I thoroughly looked at the front end, or so we thought. The first thing we went to was the steering stabilizer. Now ours was completely shot and it was pretty much useless. So we replaced it knowing that this wasn't going to be a 100% solution, but it would help temporarily resolve or mask any symptoms of death wobble. We did also check the other components on the front end, but we didn't see anything obvious. After continuing to drive the Jeep over the next few weeks, no symptoms reappeared, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this very simple solution was really the fix. Fast forward to the beginning of 2019. After another almost 2 years of wheeling and modifications, I began to feel some hints of the wobble once again. It was nothing major, just a very light shimmy on occasional highway cruises. It didn't escalate, at least not yet. With our recent summer trip on the Arizona Peace Trail coming up, I decided to look at the stabilizer again just as a precaution. The night before I left on the trip, we actually took the stabilizer off, which was now around 2 years old. Since I already had a new one on hand, we installed it just to see what would happen. The old stabilizer was still in decent shape, and it hadn't been completely blown out like the last time we changed it. The following trip went great, I had no issues on the trip, but throughout the next couple of months, the slight shimmy or wobble remained. Then, this past April, it hit again. At around 45 to 55 miles per hour, the Jeep got a violent wobble and shake, and I knew death wobble was back with a vengeance. Over the next week, it got progressively worse, and I was actually able to get the Jeep to do it pretty much on command. I found that curbing slightly left at the right speed would really provoke the wobble, which could be worsened or dampened based on speed adjustments. At this point, the Jeep basically became undrivable, and it was time to sit down and seriously look at what was causing our issue. To begin the diagnosing process, we pulled the Jeep into the driveway. You'll want to make sure you are parked on a relatively flat surface. After turning the Jeep on, you'll want to have someone move the steering wheel back and forth, while another person lays underneath the front end and looks for movement. This will allow you to simulate everyday steering and driving, and see how the components behave under normal load. What you want to do is look for any kind of side-to-side shifts or abnormal movement in key areas of the suspension on the front end. You can also use tape to mark off the top and bottom parts of a ball joint, which will help you to make seeing the movement a little bit easier, but we stuck with just the visual inspection. This idea actually comes from Bleepin' Jeep's video on death wobble, which is another good resource for this topic. What you will want to look for is any bad ball joints, any wallowed out bolts, or any loose components. We found that all of this was going on underneath our Jeep. The pitman arm near the steering box had some solid up and down movement and clunking in the ball joint. It was also quite gunked up with what looked to be dust and power steering fluid. The bolt which holds the stabilizer in place was also wallowed out and had become quite loose. This explains why the wobble persisted and continued to get worse after we installed a new stabilizer a few months back. The stabilizer acts essentially like a band-aid, masking any wobbles or shakes from normal driving. Finally, all the tie rod ends were looking pretty bad. From what we could tell, all of these components were still original, so it made sense that they were beginning to fail after over 160,000 hard miles. The combination of all of these loose components adds up to the pretty severe case of death wobble that we were experiencing. The thing about death wobble is that once it gets going, it can quickly get worse. Once all of the front end starts to shake, the components get looser, and because of that, they shake more. This rapid downhill progression was caused by ignoring the situation over time. While the stabilizer initially helped cover up the wobble back in 2016, it was not going to be able to handle this amount of play in the steering. And because the components were allowed to continue to wobble over time, it had now damaged some other components in the system, such as the stabilizer bolts and the other ball joints. It was now clear that we would need to do quite a bit of work to make sure we got everything solid and performing like it should. We decided that to fully and properly fix the problem, we would need to replace just about everything related to steering on the front end. And this is what we ended up with. We ordered a heavy-duty adjustable track bar from Iron Rock Off-Road. We also got their heavy-duty tie rod, which came with new tie rod ends. Because they don't sell a drag link, we picked up a Moog drag link and additional tie rod end to round out the other components. With the exception of the steering box, this is essentially all of the steering components on the front end, and all of these can directly relate to Death Wobble. With all of these fresh ball joints and heavier duty parts, our steering should now be perfectly solid and actually a bit tougher than before. At this point, you could also opt for an over-the-knuckle setup, which raises the ball joints a couple of inches off the wheels. We opted not to do this since we haven't really had any clearance issues in the past, and right now we just wanted to get the system back to normal. The parts from Iron Rock were certainly beefy. The tie rod is made up of 1¼ inch rolled steel and was much thicker and tougher than the original factory setup. The adjustable track bar was also heavy duty, and because it was adjustable, it would be more friendly on our current lift setup as well as any future lift projects. We set to work and jacked the Jeep up and pulled off the wheels. The first step was to remove all of the old components. We began by loosening up all the bolts and nuts. I mean, they were already loose, but it was now time to junk them. The stabilizer came off first. Since this was still nearly new, we set it aside for later reinstallation. We knew that this wasn't a problem, and since it was only a couple of months old, it would be no problem to put it back in. The next step was to use this sweet tool to break off the ball joints at the tie rod ends. I don't know what it's called, but this thing absolutely ate up the ball joints. Alternatively, you could use a hammer and some kind of pry to physically hammer them out, but this way was a lot quicker and easier, and it looks cooler. Within seconds, our steering components were broke free and able to be easily removed. Looking at the ball joints coming off the Jeep, they were obviously a little banged up from the removal process, but otherwise they actually did look like they were in pretty bad shape. They were leaking, there was dust and mud everywhere, and it was pretty fair to say that they had reached the end of their life. We laid out the new components in the orientation that we would be installing them on the Jeep. This side-by-side comparison also shows the difference between the old setup and the heavier duty new setup. The track bar was next to come off, and we spent some time making sure that that bolt hole wasn't wallowed out. It appeared to be in good shape, luckily for us. If it had been damaged by the wobble, we likely would have had to drill it out a little bit and use a bigger bolt to hold everything tight. The very last castle nut on the upper part of the track bar proved to be a little bit difficult to get to, but eventually it was off as well. With all of the old components now off, all we had to do now was basically reinstall all the new parts in the reverse order. We began with the track bar. We tightened this up using the included hardware. We removed the alignment adjustment sleeve off of the old tie rod. This would be the only old component we were going to use. What this does is allow your tie rod end to connect to your drag link, and it is able to be adjusted during the alignment process. Using some very official techniques, we measure the distance between the stabilizer bolt and the drag link end. This would help to keep the geometry and alignment relatively close until we were able to get the Jeep professionally aligned at the end of this video. We put the sleeve on the new drag link and checked our measurements. Close enough. We worked late into the night as we continued to install the new parts. We bolted the drag link on and found that we were actually missing one of the boots to cover the ball joint. This wouldn't be a big deal, and it would be remedied when we had the Jeep aligned the next day. We slowly pieced our front end back together. Everything was coming together quite easily. The last step was to reinstall the steering stabilizer. With all parts now back in place, we gave them a good tighten. The front end looked pretty good. We reinstalled the wheels and put the Jeep back on the ground. The next step was to test drive the Jeep and see if all of our hard work had finally rid our Jeep of the evil death wobble. The next day, things felt good. I'm not gonna lie, it was a little weird driving a Jeep that didn't have a wobbling and wandering front end. But at all kinds of different highway speeds and different bumps, things felt solid. After a professional alignment and several weeks of daily driving the Jeep after, it appeared that we had fixed the problem for good. The front end, with all new components, was now solid. It also didn't hurt to have a few heavier duty items up there as well. If these ever get hit by something out on the trail, they should hold up to the abuse a little better than the factory parts. While this likely won't happen often, if ever, it's an extra reassurance to have out on the trail. And perhaps most importantly, death wobble was now gone for good, and it was done the right way. While this adventure was certainly a bit our fault for not properly diagnosing the problem right the first time 3 years ago, it shows just how finicky the front end of these Jeeps can be. One loose part can lead to a host of other issues, and before you know it, you are wobbling your way down the road. There are other factors that can contribute to death wobble, such as wheels, wheel balance issues, alignment issues. I felt like we had to tackle this issue pretty much head on. I hope this video was helpful to explain how death wobble can be diagnosed and fixed, and specifically how it affected our ZJ over the last several years. Anyway, that is it for part 12 of our ZJ project series. If you are new to our channel or new to the ZJ project series, we do have a full playlist of all parts of this series up until this point, so you are able to get caught up on the build. Thank you for watching this one, and as always, we'll see you on the next modification video or trip real soon.